We are here with Dr. Najati Al-Khan. We are discussing, continuing from last week, the subject of Baha'u'llah and his son and successor, Abdu'l Baha, who were in contact with Ottoman statesmen and reformers from the 1860s onwards, with a claim to a new religious dispensation. Baha'u'llah, calling himself a world reformer, composed many writings stressing not only the spiritual regeneration and advancement of humanity, but also material progress. Based on these writings, Abdu'l Baha further elaborated his father's ideas and promoted these among reform-minded Ottoman statesmen. A special attention in this talk are the unpublished Turkish writings of Abdu'l Baha. With that being said, Dr. Al-Khan is a research associate at University of Bamberg in Germany between 2015 and 2022, and currently he is affiliated with the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Israel. We gave a little introduction last session, but we want to dive into this subject and try to answer some people's questions today. So with that being said, we welcome all of you to please reach out to the Clearwater Baha'i's YouTube channel and the Baha'i Center of Clearwater Facebook page and see the previous video where we've actually shown some samples of documents pertaining to the exile of Baha'u'llah from the Ottoman records. With that being said, Dr. Najati Al-Khan, welcome. Let us begin.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone, for the second talk. As you said, I will continue what I talked about last Sunday. I already mentioned that the Babi and Baha'i religions appeared in a time when there was reform ongoing in the Ottoman Empire. It started in the 1840s and continued up to the 20th century. And so within this huge change in the Ottoman Empire and then consequently in Iran, the Babis and Baha'is, meaning the Bab, Baha'u'llah, and Abdu'l Baha and his followers, were in this environment, and this or the other way they interacted with different people, starting actually not in the 1860s, as I said in the description, but in the 1850s when Baha'u'llah was exiled to Baghdad in 1853. So from that point on, he and Abdu'l Baha was a child then. They were in contact with various sorts of people, Ottoman officials, Ottoman people just in general, and also Iranian expatriates in Baghdad and in Iraq. So, and we know that Baha'u'llah was frequenting in Baghdad coffee houses twice a day. And so he was in contact with many people. He would advise people in the coffee houses. He would talk with them. They would ask questions. The same applied to Abdu'l Baha, who, even though he was only 10 years old at that time, he was described as being so exceptional because of this divine gift of being the son of Baha'u'llah, that he also would discuss difficult matters with various sorts of people, including Ottoman statesmen. And especially then when Baha'u'llah was banished to Istanbul and Edirne, it was these contexts were more intense in terms of also addressing these reform issues that were going on in the Ottoman Empire. And Baha'u'llah frequently, in many of his tablets, touches on the issue of reform, not only, of course, the Ottoman Empire and Iran, but the whole world. As you said, John, he called himself a world reformer, which is beyond national borders. But Baha'u'llah also specifically talks about certain issues that need to be given attention by humanity in many of his tablets. So he's addressing kings and rulers, as we know, starting in Edirne and then in Akka, and then in this collection tablets revealed after the Kitab-i Akdas, tablets of Baha'u'llah, he also takes up and elaborates many issues that were discussed in the Ottoman Empire and Iran. And what I will do today is just to give a brief overview of some thoughts of or some statements of Baha'u'llah relating to reform and his addresses to especially King Sultan Abdul Aziz and Sultan Abdul Hamid II, but especially I will talk about Abdu'l Baha's contacts with Ottoman statesmen and reformers, and review his ideas about Ottoman reform and what he proposed to his contacts, actually what they should do in order to improve the situation in the Ottoman Empire. So we have basically two generations of reformers in the Ottoman Empire. I will mention this later, but just briefly, we have the first generation of Ottoman reformers called the Young Ottomans from the 1860s on up to 1876. And then we have the long reign of Sultan Abdul Hamid for 33 years, who practically ruled as a dictator, if you will, as an autocratic ruler. And during his reign, another generation, a second generation of intellectuals, of young Ottoman intellectuals who were opposing Abdul Hamid, they formed a secret group called the Young Turk Movement. And so Abdu'l Baha, in some ways, were in contact with these people, because also these people were regarded as dissidents. And so Abdu'l Baha also was regarded as a dissident in the Ottoman Empire. So their ways crossed, if you will. And so I will also touch on this issue. And I would like to do this also sharing my screen with you. I prepared a PowerPoint presentation. Let me just, I think you can see it now. John, is it okay?
Yes, now it is. Now it's
okay,
fine.
Great.
Thank you.
Great. So as I said, Baha'u'llah claimed, as we know, to put it in neutral terms, claimed a new religious dispensation, starting openly in Baghdad in 1863, and then in successive writings and tablets, he touched upon the issue of reform, world reform, and he called himself world reformer, and stressing not only spiritual regeneration of the world, of humanity, but also material progress. And this genesis of the Baha'i faith from 1863 was, I mean, the whole world was changing. It was a global religion, political change all over the world, from America to China. And so the Ottoman Empire underwent also changes since the late 18th century. So I will touch also upon the reforms that were made in the Ottoman Empire. Basically, to sum it up, more or less it started in 1789, which is also the year of the French Revolution. Sultan Selim III was made Sultan in 1789, and being an open-minded and Western-oriented Sultan, if you will, he commenced some military reforms in order to keep up with the progress in Europe, because at that time the Ottomans were weak militarily and were losing territories. and Europe was gaining more power, the European powers, especially France and England. So the Ottomans had to keep up with that. So Sultan Selim started military reforms, also by calling French advisors to the empire. And so, but his reform attempts were more or less not really successful. Then his nephew, Mahmud II, he paved the way actually for later reforms. He centralized the state, especially the government in Istanbul, and his own position. And before he could officially proclaim this reform period, he died, and his son, Sultan Abdul Mejid, from 1839 on, he proclaimed the first Tanzimat, which is called the Tanzimat, the reorganization or reform period, which included extensive reforms in all spheres of the Ottoman Empire, and which continued in the time of Abdulaziz, and then later during the time of Abdul Hamid, and up to the Young Turk era starting from 1908, and then ending with the Young Turk rule and the loss at World War I together with Germany. So basically, that's just to touch upon the reforms that were started with Sultan Abdul Mejid, the Sultan Abdul Mejid. So he, as I said, he officially in 1839 proclaimed the Tanzimat, which included the guaranteeing and securing the safety of life, honor, and property of all the subjects. He introduced a new tax system. The conscription into the army was also reformed, and on paper at least, it was limited to a certain period. Provincial cabinets were set up, including leaders of Muslim and non-Muslim communities. But all in all, these reforms were not really realized, so that in 1856, a second reform edict was issued and proclaimed also by Sultan Abdul Mejid, which reiterated the equality of all Ottoman subjects and the equality of Muslims and all non-Muslims, especially Christians, comprised every aspect of society, and even gave the Christians some advantages over the Muslims, which of course caused the jealousy of the Muslims towards the Christians. And there were other many political and social reforms that were continued, which paved the way later for the first Ottoman constitution in 1876. So after Sultan Abdul Mejid, he died in 1861. His brother, Sultan Abdul Aziz, came to the throne, and he continued the Tanzimat, the reforms, under the leadership of his chief ministers, Fuad Pasha and Ali Pasha, who are both known in Baha'i history. And these two powerful men exchanged offices as prime and foreign minister for several decades. So what was continuing as reforms was that, for example, Council of State, the consultative council was set up in 1868. The public education, which was up to then more or less Islamic, comprising Muslim schools, was more and more based on the French model. Starting from 1861, we have many technical developments such as railroads, and then we have the first civil code. And Abdul Aziz was then the first sultan who ever went to Western Europe in 1867, and also met Napoleon III and Queen Victoria of Britain, both of whom also Baha'u'llah had addressed or would address. And we have then other reforms such as modernization of the Navy, and then but financial difficulties, and then natural disasters, and especially the building of new palaces by Abdulaziz caused the Ottoman public debt, which was announced in October 1875. And for this disorder or confusion in the Ottoman Empire, actually Sultan Abdulaziz was deposed because of his arrogance. It was said he was arrogant and just wasting the money. And then he was deposed in 1876 and later died. Most probably he was killed. Some say he committed suicide in one of the palaces. In any case, as I mentioned, there was the first generation of young Ottoman intellectuals called the Young Ottomans, who mostly were state officers and who opposed actually these top-down state reforms called Tanzimat. These young Ottomans were against these. They said the Tanzimat reforms were superficial and not going deep to the problems. So they criticized Ali and Fuad Pasha, saying that they were just aping Europe, aping the West, and not really concerned with reforming the empire. And in the eyes of the young Ottomans, Ali and Fuad Pasha were elitist and autocratic, and they actually favored a bureaucratic oligarchy, meaning that they were behind this idea that just few capable ministers should rule the Ottoman Empire. And they even disregarded some of the capacities or the powers of the Sultan. They limited the Sultan's power, which was first Abdul Majid and then Abdulaziz. And Ali and Fuad Pasha were also especially keen to implement Western ideals and laws and less the Islamic Sharia. It became actually less important during this time. And on the other hand, the young Ottomans who regarded themselves Muslims, but also were facing the West, if you will, they wanted a synthesis of Islam and the West. And so they claimed that the things like parliament, consultation, or constitution, they had all Islamic roots, and they were really they were very busy publishing articles about these issues, about problems in the Ottoman Empire, about this synthesis of Islam and the West, and also especially about the importance of a constitution in the Ottoman Empire, a parliamentary monarchy actually, which they wanted to import from Britain. So after Ali and Fuad died, the young Ottomans realized their goals actually. They set up a constitution in 1876 under the auspices of Sultan Abdul Hamid II. And parliament was set up in 1877 with the representatives of ethnic and national minorities of the Ottoman Empire along Muslims. And one of the main ideas or ideologies of the young Ottomans was that they propagated Ottomanism that should prevent nationalisms in the Ottoman Empire, but this failed later because nationalist movements, also encouraged by Europe, were strong, and regions, especially in the Balkans, split up from the Ottoman Empire and became independent, such as Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and others. So this hope of the young Ottomans to unite all Ottoman subjects proved, unfortunately, not to be fruitful. We have another powerful statesman, Mithat Pasha, who in the 1870s was the patron of the young Ottoman movement. He was a very able and powerful Pasha, also backed up by Britain, who also was province governor, for example, in Bulgaria, in Baghdad, and in Syria, and many other places. He was twice prime minister, even though for short periods. But during his second term in 1876 to 1877, he was the one actually who pressed for the Ottoman constitution and parliament, and who also was successful in proclaiming these under the auspices of Sultan Abdul Hamid II. And usually Mithat Pasha is called the father of the Ottoman constitution. And so in this third Tanzimat edict, if you will, reform edict, which included the Ottoman constitution, equal rights for all citizens, Ottoman citizens, without distinction of race or creed, was proclaimed. And then you had independent judiciary based on civil rather than religious law, universal elementary education, even though it was, I mean, not perfect, but it was kind of developing. And then there was a parliament and the Senate, who actually on paper was appointed by the Sultan. And but as I said, internal financial and diplomatic crisis in 1875 and 76 provided Mithat Pasha a chance to introduce the constitution. And so Mithat Pasha is actually responsible for the deposition and death of Sultan Abdul Aziz, as was also earlier prophesied by Baha'u'llah. And Mithat Pasha, before he did anything against Sultan Abdul Aziz, he had secret talks with Prince Abdul Hamid, who became later Sultan Abdul Hamid II. And so Abdul Hamid actually agreed to all terms that Mithat Pasha was putting forward, and she appeared to be, reform friendly, or appeared to be supporting the idea of constitution and parliament, and so he became Sultan in 1876. But the mistake of Mithat Pasha was that the Article 113 in the Ottoman Constitution gave the Sultan the power to banish anyone from the empire without trial or other legal procedure. That was the grievous mistake for Mithat Pasha, because it was used against him later on, due to the deposition and death of Sultan Abdul Aziz, actually. And then we have, as I mentioned, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who agreed to the constitution and parliament, but the Ottoman-Russian War in 1877-78 and the defeat of the Ottomans was the pretext for Abdul Hamid to actually suspend the parliament and constitution in 1878. He said it was not necessary in this chaotic period to have a parliament and a constitution. And so basically until 1908, 1909, for 33 years, he ruled more or less alone as an autocratic ruler. And Abdul Hamid is famous for being suspicious of anyone with liberal ideas, and anyone who was in his close vicinity, anyone who was writing about him, any little thing he would censor. And he had a vast spy network, which also was used later against Abdu'l Baha. So what Abdul Hamid did when he became Sultan was he got rid of Mithat Pasha due to that article in the constitution, and because he accused Mithat Pasha of the murder of Sultan Abdul Aziz, which was the uncle of Abdul Hamid. But nevertheless, despite all, say, negative traits of Abdul Hamid, far-reaching modernization continued, reforms as well, especially in education. Secular Ottoman schools were set up to counter foreign missionary influence, for example. And one of the markers of the reign of Sultan Abdul Hamid was actually that he utilized this ideology of pan-Islamism as the state ideology for the unity of Muslims, not only in the Ottoman Empire, but all over the world. And this pan-Islam, this unity of Islam, should give an Ottoman Islamic identity and morality to all the Muslim subjects, not only in the Ottoman Empire. And but despite so many reforms in the Ottoman Empire, the time of Abdul Hamid II was actually the worst time, when the Ottomans lost most of the territories, especially in the Balkans. And then coming to the second generation of the reformers, we have the Young Turks, and these were actually a bunch of young 5 medical students who in 1889 formed a secret Masonic anti-religious, scientific and materialistic movement or group. And in Europe, they were called Young Turks. And one of them actually, Abdu'l Baha, whose name you can see here, he was the main ideologist who also later actually with his reformist ideas influenced Mustafa Kemal Atatürk with his reforms in the Turkish Republic. And Abdu'l Baha, one of the initial Young Turks, was actually also put on trial in 1922 because he wrote very positively about the Baha'i religion. That's another topic for itself. That may be another talk if there is wish. In any case, so the Young Turks were the ones who organized the revolution against the dictator, as they said, Sultan Abdulhamid II in 1908, which also had freed Abdu'l Baha. And the goal of the Young Turks was actually to reestablish the constitutional regime of 1876 and also the parliament. And after a counter-revolution, which was directed against the Young Turks, and which was supposedly organized by Sultan Abdulhamid II, the Young Turks deposed him as Sultan in 1908, and they exiled him and put him in house prison. I don't think it's the correct word. So he was exiled to Thessaloniki in Greece, and then he was deposed and wasn't Sultan anymore. And the Young Turks were very, seemed to be at least idealistic with their democratic, so-called democratic ideas, and their slogan, freedom, equality, and brotherhood, inspired by the French Revolution. But this was only a very short period after 1908, in which actually the Muslims, the Christians, the Jews, all ethnic minorities in the Ottoman Empire, they were so hopeful that a new era would begin, where all were brothers and sisters in the Ottoman Empire. But unfortunately, in 1913, then militant nationalist Young Turks staged a coup d'etat, and then 3 pashas, Talat, Enver, and Cemal, I will come to them later, they ruled as dictators. And actually this Young Turk rule proved to be more bloodier and crueler than the time of Sultan Abdulhamid. And having said this, in World War I, the Young Turks sided with the Germans and lost the war in 1918. And one of the 3 pashas, Cemal Pasha, I will mention later, was an outspoken enemy of Abdu'l Baha. Here you see a postcard on the left, Young Turks celebrating freedom, and then the 3 pashas who would take over and basically cause the destruction of the Ottoman Empire. So coming to Baha'u'llah's context with Ottoman statesmen, we know that he had many contacts starting in Baghdad, good and bad ones, especially in Istanbul. His contacts proved to be with non-friendly Ottomans, if you will. And so Baha'u'llah wrote, has many statements about what he observed in Istanbul. For example, he says that nothing has been seen from Istanbul's inhabitants but conventional officious formalities. And with regard to the statement in Istanbul, he stated, we found upon our arrival in the city, its governors and elders as children gathered about and disporting themselves with clay. We perceived no one sufficiently mature to acquire from us the truths which God hath taught us, nor ripe for our wondrous words of wisdom. Our inner eye wept sore over them and over their transgressions and their total disregard of the thing for which they were created. And Baha'u'llah also heavily criticized Ali and Fuad Pasha in some of his tablets addressed to them, also Sultan Abdul Aziz. And so his criticism actually in this regard is similar to that of the young Ottomans, who also were against autocratic rule, injustice, arrogance, and carelessness for the people in the empire. But despite the injustice by Abdul Aziz, Baha'u'llah presents himself as his advisor, and he urges the Sultan to follow the commandments of God, act impartially towards his subjects, and not to allow anybody to oppress them. He tells him to be a just king and calls him God's shadow on earth. So this quote, which you see, is in this Surah Al-Muluk, which is in the summons of the Lord of Hosts, which I will not read now, but continue. So Baha'u'llah furthermore says to Sultan Abdul Aziz that he should not leave the affairs of the state into the hand of others, and not to rely on his ministers who are not worthy of his trust, but on ministers who are upright and just. And he advised the Sultan to counsel with them. And this is, as I said in my last talk, it's a Quranic metaphor. It's a verse from the Quran, to counsel with them in state affairs. And so Baha'u'llah actually here takes up the matter of consultation in human affairs in general, but specifically in the government. And consultation, as I had also mentioned last Sunday, was a code word, common terminology with young Ottoman and Iranian reformers in the 19th century, and a code word for parliament, implying democracy. But we know that Sultan Abdul Aziz did not heed Baha'u'llah's advices, and long before Abdul Aziz was deposed, Baha'u'llah actually told this about him and Ali and Fuad Pasha. So he basically addresses Fuad Pasha, saying, "Soon will dismiss the one who was like unto him, Ali Pasha, and will lay hold on the chief, Sultan Abdul Aziz, who ruleth the land. And I verily am the Almighty, the All-Compelling." And on the photo on the right, you see Abdul Aziz after his arrest, humiliated, and then, as I said, imprisoned in one of his palaces. And later, I think a few days later, he was found covered in blood, dead in his room, and most probably he was killed. He was murdered. So Baha'u'llah stigmatized, actually owing to his unjust treatment by Sultan Abdul Aziz, the seat of the Ottoman Empire in the Kitab-i-Aqdas as being the throne of tyranny, from where one could hear the hooting of the owl. So the owl being an ominous animal with bad omen. And Shogh Effendi in The Promised Days Come actually says that of the two despots, meaning like Abdul Aziz and Nasruddin Shah, Abdul Aziz was the more powerful, the more exalted in rank, the more preeminent in guilt, and the more concerned with the tribulations and fortunes of the founder of our faith. He it was who, through his firmans, had thrice banished Baha'u'llah, and in whose dominions the manifestation of God spent almost the whole of his 40 years' captivity. It was during his reign and that of his nephew and successor Abdul Hamid II that the center of the covenant of God, meaning Abdu'l Baha, had to endure for no less than 40 years in the fortress town of Akka, an incarceration fraught with so many perils, affronts, and privations. But despite Baha'u'llah's criticisms of Ottoman rule, in unpublished tablets from the late Akka period, from around 1890, Baha'u'llah has also good words for Sultan Abdul Hamid, for his just reign and efforts at reforming the Ottoman Empire. In one tablet, Baha'u'llah says, "This wronged one beareth witness that the Sultan by name of Abdul Hamid held fast unto the court of justice and fairness and renounced tyranny and iniquity. Baha'u'llah praises him because he, quote, established himself on the seat of consultation and taketh counsel at all times with the ministers and the learned ones regarding the affairs of the state, and desireth that which the people have desired. He possesseth a clear vision and a penetrating bright intelligence. These are all provisional translations, and Baha'u'llah adds that nothing proceeded from the Sultan which has caused him sadness. In another unpublished Persian tablet addressed to Sultan Abdul Hamid, Baha'u'llah says that God may protect him from evils and commends the Sultan for being occupied day and night personally with the reformation of the affairs of the subjects and the empire. In the same tablet, Baha'u'llah also praised the Sultan for resorting to consultation in all matters. Again, he takes up this matter. In this tablet, Baha'u'llah repeatedly lauds Abdul Hamid for the reformation of the empire and says that for this reason, God has honored him with the attribute Al-Hamid, the praised one. And Baha'u'llah says here, God hath adorned the throne of his cause with a just and equitable Sultan and exalted him with his name, the praised one, as a token of his grace and a sign of his mercy. Overall, Baha'u'llah in various tablets states that the real aim of the prophets of God is only the reformation of the world or the rehabilitation of the peoples of the earth. And as was mentioned, he claims himself to be the life giver and world reformer. And with this, we see that Baha'u'llah's reforms also go beyond national borders, unlike Ottoman reformers' ideas. And so what we see here is that despite the injustices of the Ottoman state, Baha'u'llah advised its representatives to exert themselves actually for the betterment of the situation of the people and the reformation of state affairs. And as we say, in this respect, he lauds the good governance of Abdul Hamid. And in fact, we have no record of an unjust treatment towards the Baha'is by Abdul Hamid from 1876 until the passing of Baha'u'llah in 1892. It was only afterwards that through the instigations of the half-brother of Abdu'l Baha, the center of covenant breaking, that Abdul Hamid became suspicious and hostile and toward Abdu'l Baha and molested him continuously. Abdu'l Baha, already in Baha'u'llah's lifetime, too, presented himself concerned with the political situation and discussed the political climate during the reform period in the Ottoman Empire and Iran. We have, for example, you all know the secret of divine civilization, which is a topic for another talk. I don't talk about this today, but Abdu'l Baha from very early on was concerned with these matters. And we have a description of someone who was near Abdu'l Baha, and he says that Abdu'l Baha was concerned with the thoughts of the statesmen. He was saying that the statesmen actually of the East were weak, their hearts devoid of desire for the progress of the nation, their ideas petty, selfish, local, and not general. They thought of their own interests rather than those of the country. And then he is quoted as having said, they think more of the advancement of their own interests than those of the country. They are not far-seeing patriots, but inexperienced tyros. They sell the resources of their country if they think that by so doing they can fill their own pockets. As in Baghdad, also in Edirne, Abdu'l Baha was widely known for his qualities and deep intellect, and Ottoman officials, high and low, were admiring Abdu'l Baha despite his young age. And one of them, who I mentioned also last week, was the governor of Edirne, Hurshid Pasha, who consulted Abdu'l Baha actually about the future of the Ottoman Empire. And then Abdu'l Baha tells him a story about a sick man who was given opium by the watchman that made him sleep, contrary to the doctor's advice, and got worse. And then Abdu'l Baha says to the governor, "It is your watch time. You are not doing anything to improve the condition of the sick country. You are putting it to sleep by giving it narcotics. And when you leave your position, what do you care whether the patient will live or die? You have had your night's sleep. Instead of watching the patient solicitously and pulling him through, you prefer your own rest and comfort." Basically telling this governor that no one is really concerned with the problems in the Ottoman Empire. And as I mentioned, Abdu'l Baha composed his Secret of Divine Civilization in 1875, which more refers to reform in Iran. And he was asked so by Baha'u'llah. In fact, we have a quote about that he instructed Abdu'l Baha to write some pages on the causes of the world destruction and the means for its reconstruction, and so on. And we have a Turkish tablet by Abdu'l Baha, which is from 1913, and where he directly speaks about the Tanzimat, about Ottoman reforms. He basically says that Iran's worsening conditions was caused by ignorant Muslim clerics, and Iran's need for reform should be after the model of the Ottomans. And Abdu'l Baha's emphasis in this tablet is on secular reforms, and he says that the Muslim clerics should only be concerned with spiritual and ethical matters and not with politics, and they should educate the people and guide their conduct. I will just read a few things from this tablet just to show you, and I've put some Turkish from this tablet, some of the Turkish phrases, so that you can see how also Abdu'l Baha wrote in Turkish. Basically, what Abdu'l Baha says, I may not read all of it, but just some of it. He says, whereas such a long time has passed and every spot of the world has developed, the East and the West have been revived, and modern advancements have increased, only the ancient people of Iran are still wandering in the wilderness of ignorance and are plunged into the whirlpool of error. Its misery, degradation, and contemptible state increases day by day. And the established cause and terrible reason for this is that ignorant ulama interfere in the affairs of the empire and oppose the government. This is as evident and clear as the sun. The holy duty of the religious leaders is not but to share with everyone the knowledge of the water of certitude, lead the nation to the best conduct, save them from the valley of error, show them the highway of guidance, advance the ethics of the nations through exhortations and counsels, save them from the wrath of God, strengthen their hopes for the divine favors, and urge them to acquire human virtues and merits. It is not theirs to interfere in the affairs of the government, to oppose the just government, to cause the kingdom and nation to be in a deplorable condition and drown the people in ignorance. And later on, Abdu'l Baha also speaks that the king of Iran, the Shah of Iran, who was at that time Ahmad Shah, he lauds him for initiating different reforms in Iran and inaugurate governmental reforms, military organization, and so on, in order that Iran may become a source of felicity and progress. And then Abdu'l Baha says, this matter is extraordinarily favorable and praiseworthy, for the sublime Ottoman state was previously afflicted with immense difficulties with regard to the state and the people. However, after establishing laws and regulations, the sublime Ottoman state becomes a stable state and the Turkish nation honorable. And he says that the present state, meaning in his time, was better than the political or the general state in the time of Sultan Mahmud II in the 1830s. And so here Abdu'l Baha actually praises the Ottomans for their reform and sees it as a model for Iran. Now, before I continue to speak about reform, Abdu'l Baha's ideas on reform, I would like to share with you just two appreciations of Abdu'l Baha in Ottoman publications. There were many articles published in the 1910s and 20s about the Babi and Baha'i religions, especially about Abdu'l Baha. And here you see a few of the publications which also have the photo of Abdu'l Baha. And there are many, many others, just two of them. One of the members of the young Ottoman movement, as I just mentioned. This gentleman, Bereketzade Ismail Hakkı, who, due to his what was perceived as dissident ideas, he was exiled actually to Akka in 1873 and stayed there for 3 years. And in his memoirs later, Bereketzade Ismail Hakkı, he mentions his impressions about Abdu'l Baha, and gives a vivid and positive picture of the Baha'i community in Akka in this book. He says, during our stay in Akka, Baha'u'llah Effendi left the administration of community affairs to Abbas Effendi because he had retired to his rented house and only appeared to his followers, meaning Baha'u'llah. If Abbas Effendi's character and attitude are carefully examined, it appears that his behavior and manner remind of being more political than sheikh-like. If an article on Iran in the foreign press came across his attentive eyes, he would, devoting himself to it, explain his thoughts for hours and enjoyed this so much that he sacrificed his sleep and comfort. Sometimes, having written articles in Arabic and Persian, he sent them with their French translations to the European press. And because he had won the hearts of the people of Akka by his friendly association, the beauty of his getting along with them, his generosity and goodness, visitors, rich and poor, Muslim and non-Muslim, would come and go all the time to the place used as the male part of the house. Delicious teas and the finest tobaccos of Shiraz were served with water pipes to the guests. A great many times it happened that Abbas Effendi gave banquets in the garden he had bought outside the city walls. After going out together for a walk and having eaten, we again used to return together to the fortress. As a principal, Bereketzade speaks positively about Abdu'l Baha and regarded him, he calls him Mirza Abbas Effendi, as an erudite and noble figure who is cognizant of the conditions of the age. He further describes the Baha'i children who were taught the Quran with its Persian meaning, were introduced to different areas of study and instructed in European languages like French and German, and that some members of the Baha'i community were occupied with crafts and trade. His observations of the Baha'is in Akka conclude with the words, both the good conduct of the community and the children are indeed worthy of appreciation. Another statesman, an Ottoman official from Akka, was this gentleman Abdul Ghani Seni. He knew Abdu'l Baha since his childhood and in his youth, and his account on Abdu'l Baha was written in the beginning of World War I. It was a series of 3 articles with the title An Oriental Sage Challenging the West, and published in a progressive journal in the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul. And his articles are based on his acquaintance with Abdu'l Baha and some of the talks Abdu'l Baha had delivered during his journeys in the West. It's an admiring description of Abdu'l Baha, which I want to read to you. So he says in the beginning of the first article, Abdu'l Baha Abbas Effendi, there is no doubt that the number of those who do not know this name is greater than that of those who do. It is always like this among us Easterners. Before we get to know and learn about the great and important personalities who grew up among us, Europe, even America, gets to know them, appreciates them, reflect about them, make them a topic of conversation, and even write many works about them, until we learn about our own and claim them again. Isn't it quite strange? Abbas Effendi is one of those Eastern personalities who is not present with us, but is present in the world of science and wisdom in Europe and America. His absence among us is not in a personal sense, but in a spiritual sense, because he spent most of his life among us and still does. Then he says that Sheikh Abbas Effendi was the honorable son of the Iranian Baha'u'llah Effendi, leader of the Babi sect, who, like other political prisoners, was liberated through the kindness of the Young Turks, traveled to Europe and America, accepting thereby unceasing ardent invitations. And Abdul Ghani Seni, he actually focuses on the personality of Abdu'l Baha, who he calls the erudite and the virtuous Sheikh Abbas Effendi, whom he had known since his childhood in Akka and whose personal qualities and evidences of his perfections he had admired. And then he continues saying, I will talk about this wise and virtuous personality, whom I knew from my childhood and admired his integrity and perfection, some of the traits and superior merits, and some speeches in Europe and America. Sheikh Abbas Effendi is now an honorable wise man in his 70s. During my childhood and youth, I was often in his learned presence in Akka and benefited from the pearls of his wisdom and perfect exemplary behavior. There was no one in his congregations who was not full of admiration for his exalted and virtuous character. Only in the previous era of Sultan Abdul Hamid II, some corrupt governors with the prospect of money harassed this honorable person with innumerable tribulations, sufferings, and dangers. Since Sheikh Effendi was steadfast, resolute, and resigned in proportion to his gentleness, compassion, goodness, and clemency, he was indifferent and unconcerned about the machinations and schemes that were devised against him. In the end, his opponents were ashamed and overwhelmed. In their difficult times, he did not withhold his humane help from them, and thus made them deeply ashamed. He continues, actually, it will take too long, but I have a PowerPoint presentation, and this talk is being recorded, so you can read it later on. So basically, this Ottoman official speaks very positively about the intelligence, about the behavior of Abdu'l Baha. And I want to read this last passage in which the author says, the captivating discourses of Abbas Effendi fully enchant the human heart. When I asked the sublime and dignified person who made me and my friend extremely grateful and inspired to have his talk translated into Turkish and published in one of the Istanbul newspapers, he did not refuse. Abbas Effendi's perfect knowledge of each of the three languages, Arabic, Turkish, and Persian, is indeed astonishing. He can write prose and poetry in all three languages like a native speaker. So you can see just a little bit of some descriptions about Abdu'l Baha from some Ottomans who personally knew him or have met him. There are many others. And one of them actually was also Mithat Pasha, who I have already mentioned, who was twice prime minister and also governor. And in his time as governor of Syria, which was an exile for him actually by Sultan Abdul Hamid II, he met Abdu'l Baha in Akka in the garden of Rezwan in May 1880 during an inspection tour of the province. And the Baha'i Mirza Haydar Ali, in one of his unpublished memoirs, he describes the meeting of Mithat Pasha with Abdu'l Baha in the Rezwan garden in Akka. So he quotes Mithat Pasha as having said, "For years I have longed to meet him. I have seen his utterances in Turkish that are beyond like or equal and eloquently testify to his vast knowledge. I have often heard many of the learned highly praising and extolling him." And also Mirza Haydar Ali says that Mithat Pasha had heard about Abdu'l Baha's utterances in Turkish, which were proof of his immense knowledge. He says that Abdu'l Baha's clear and adequate replies to inquiries about spiritual matters in most eloquent Turkish caused the eloquent and learned men of Turkestan to confess their weakness and made them humble and lowly. Later, Mithat Pasha invited Abdu'l Baha to Beirut, the seat of the province. And Abdu'l Baha actually, although being a prisoner, traveled to Beirut by the express invitation, as Mr. Balyuzi says, of one of the most brilliant statesmen of the Ottoman Empire, Mithat Pasha, the liberal reformer, who as Grand Vizier was instrumental in inducing the Sultan to grant a constitution to his people. And Shogh Effendi in God Passes By says about this meeting, "It was through the extraordinary warm reception accorded him during his visit to Beirut Through his contact with Mithat Pasha, a former Grand Vizier of Turkey, and through his constant association with officials, notables, and leading ecclesiastics who, in increasing number, had besought his presence, that he had succeeded in raising the prestige of the cause he had championed to a level it had never previously attained. We know that Abdu'l Baha was freed in 1908 by the Young Turk Revolution, which occurred on 24th July 1908, and Abdu'l Baha was released in August 1908, just a few weeks later, from imprisonment as a result of a general amnesty for political prisoners. Often in his talks in the West, actually, Abdu'l Baha praises this Young Turk committee, which was called Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, for releasing him and the efforts for freedom. But Abdu'l Baha was stating his appreciation for his liberation, and before it was clear that the military wing of the CUP would take over and cause him trouble. Until recently, we didn't know how and through whom Abdu'l Baha was freed from imprisonment. In light of Turkish letters that he wrote after his release, and which are at the Baha'i World Center, we know that he had quietly developed contacts with the civilian parliamentarian wing of the Young Turk Circus in Istanbul and Thessaloniki, now in Greece, during the reign of Abdul Hamid II. In those letters, Abdu'l Baha praises the CUP and supports their goals. Two persons who were in contact with Abdu'l Baha, with whom Abdu'l Baha communicated, was actually the first one was this gentleman, Mehmet Tahir Bey, who was an prolific Ottoman writer. He was a mystic. He was initially supporter of the Young Turk movement, and who also was a teacher at the military school in the Balkans, and also actually teacher of Mustafa Kemal, the later Ataturk. And so Abdu'l Baha somehow got into contact with this gentleman, apparently through a Baha'i, which you see below in the group photo, Ahmed Sheikh Effendi, who was among Istanbul Baha'is here in 1919. And so Abdu'l Baha, in these Turkish letters, which were written after his release, he says that he was in prison for 40 years under the tyrant Abdul Hamid. After the revolution, the Committee of Union and Progress took the chains and fetters from the neck of this destitute stranger, meaning from Abdu'l Baha, and placed them around the neck of the tyrannical and bloodthirsty Abdul Hamid. In a letter to this Mehmet Tahir Bey, Abdu'l Baha thanks the Committee of the Young Turks for its high-mindedness and justice in liberating him, and adds that through the revolution, the radiating light of the morn of liberty illumined the horizons of the country. And Abdu'l Baha calls Rumelia, which is practically the Balkans and European Turkey, where the revolution started, the dayspring of the lights of freedom and the dawning place of the lights of truth. There's a third person who was in quite close contact with Abdu'l Baha, in personal contact actually. It's this Hasan Bedrettin Pasha, or Bedri Pasha as he was known. He was a soldier, a military commander, a writer and translator from French, and involved as a young soldier actually in the deposition of Sultan Abdul Aziz, after which he was exiled to Palestine and Syria as a colonel. And after the 1908 Young Turk Revolution, Bedri Pasha was Governor General in the Albanian province of Shkodër in Albania from 1909-1911. And Persian Baha'i sources, two of them mention Bedri Bey as being exiled to Akka, translator of Abdu'l Baha into French, and the Baha'i. So one of the physicians of Abdu'l Baha, Dr. Habib Muhayyad, says, Bedri Bey, who later became Bedri Pasha, was one of the prisoners of Akka who was extremely bright and well-educated. Frequently, he attained the presence of the master. Subsequently, he became a believer. And later, the other physician of Abdu'l Baha, Dr. Yunus Khan Afrukhte, mentions that prominent people such as Bedri Pasha would humbly walk behind Abdu'l Baha, bow themselves before the shrine of Baha'u'llah and emulate Abdu'l Baha in kissing the threshold as they enter the shrine itself. In one of his talks in the West, in America, actually, Abdu'l Baha mentions Bedri Pasha. He says, the cause of God has always appeared from the East, but it has been more effective in the West. Once Bedri Pasha said in an address, "Gentlemen, Westerners have taken everything from us. The sciences, the arts, and the laws they took from the East. Now we fear that they may wrest from us the cause of Baha'u'llah as well." But Abdu'l Baha says those were his words. But Baha'u'llah is neither of the East nor of the West, neither of the South nor of the North. In a non-Baha'i source, Bedri Pasha is mentioned as a person with whom Abbas Effendi was most cordial and passed most of the time of the day within Akka and spoke Persian for hours. Bedri is described as being a benign and very intelligent man who was fluent in speaking and writing Arabic, Persian, and French, and having translated many operas from French into Turkish, in addition to being skilled in calligraphy that he used to write with his fingernails. Here we have a photo of Bedri Pasha with his two daughters, and actually I was lucky enough to find the great-granddaughter of Bedri Pasha. She's living in Turkey, and she sent me this photo. And Abdu'l Baha has about 30 Turkish letters to Bedri Pasha, some with political content. And in some of his letters to Bedri Pasha, Abdu'l Baha praises his exceptional administration in Albania as Governor General. He encourages Bedri to establish unity based on Baha'i core beliefs by abolishing division and enmity amongst the diverse people of the province. He says that it's crucial to deliver the people from ignorance and inertia and bring them into the civilized world. Abdu'l Baha also says that the means for this foremost achievement, meaning being in the civilized world, is the diffusion of knowledge and education, making it accessible to all, and so delivering the diverse sects from evils and foolish prejudices. Abdu'l Baha continues, he says that it was due to the divine confirmation which Bedri Pasha received that the people and tribes of Ishkodra, this province in Albania, who are the most fanatical in Albania, live in comfort and peace in the province. The province, Abdu'l Baha says, was different from other provinces as regards the perfect safety and peace in such a time of tumult and rebellion. And Abdu'l Baha tells Bedri Pasha to have practical and beneficial steps for the security of the country, and that it would be good to construct roads everywhere in the mountainous province. So we can see that Abdu'l Baha, like Baha'u'llah, actually gives ethical advice, spiritual advice, as well as material advice in their ideas. You see a photo of Bedri Pasha being with his staff as Governor General in Albania. Now, in another Persian tablet about the Young Turks, Abdu'l Baha addresses the Committee of Union and Progress, the Young Turk Committee, where he compares the ideals and goals of the CUP with those of the Baha'is. He says that both seek freedom, love liberty, hope for equality, are well-wishers of humanity, and ready to sacrifice their lives to unite humanity. But Abdu'l Baha says that the goals of the Young Turks are concerned with the physical world and only for the Ottoman Empire, in contrast to the Baha'is, who are concerned more with the spiritual world, and that the goals of the Baha'is are broader and wider and concern all of humanity. In that same tablet, Abdu'l Baha cautions the CUP, the Young Turk Committee, not to rely on conventional politics. He says, however much human politics shows progress, it is nothing compared to divine politics. And then I'm quoting Abdu'l Baha, also provisional translation. Divine politics is the light of the physical world and an immeasurable mercy that encompasses all peoples and nations. Therefore, we need to follow divine politics. especially in this glorious century and this age of the progress of humanity, in which nothing but divine politics leads to success. Now all the peoples of the East must be content and happy with this politics and delighted in the pervading influence of the teachings of Baha'u'llah in Europe and America. And lastly, Abdu'l Baha calls on the Baha'is to do all in their power to familiarize themselves with the benevolent aims of the Young Turk Committee and to respond to its just endeavors by assisting it. And a chance was provided to the Baha'is when Abdu'l Baha was traveling in the United States. After he arrived in New York, when Abdu'l Baha went to Washington, D.C. in April 1912, in the first week of his travels in the United States, we learned from Shoghi Effendi that a brilliant reception was given in his honor, at which many prominent members of the Washington Society met him. This occasion ranked as one of the highlights of the unforgettable mission he undertook in the service of his father's cause. And among the people of eminence who met Abdu'l Baha was actually the Ottoman ambassador at that time in Washington, Yusuf Ziya Pasha, whose photo you see here. We have a description of the meeting of Yusuf Ziya Pasha and Abdu'l Baha by the American Baha'i Juliet Thompson, in which she says in one of her books, actually, she says, as a goodwill gesture towards Turkey, the distinguished Iranian Baha'i Ali Quli Khan, who served as charge d'affaires of Iran in America and later in Istanbul, and his American wife Florence gave a luncheon and reception at the Iranian embassy in honor of Yusuf Ziya Pasha. Abdu'l Baha gave a talk, and the Pasha, being a fierce Muslim, is said to have been full of deep wonder and stated, "This is irrefutable, this is pure logic." A few days later, on 25th of April 1912, the Ottoman ambassador actually invited the illustrious Abdu'l Baha, as he said, also the Khans, Ali Quli Khan and his wife, and a group of Baha'is to dine at the Ottoman embassy. At the table, Ziya Pasha was beaming and looking at his guests with tear-filled eyes. Abdu'l Baha gave a talk about the unity of the East and the West, and Ziya Pasha made an address and called Abdu'l Baha the unique one of the age, who had come to spread his glory and perfection amongst us. The reply of Abdu'l Baha was, "I'm not worthy of this." At the end of the meeting, Ziya Pasha said, "Truly he is a saint." Florence Khan further wrote that Ziya Pasha, this is now from Florence Khan writing, became really enamored of Abdu'l Baha and called upon him day after day and attended certain of his talks. Often when Abdu'l Baha was driving about the city, he would take the ambassador along with him. Politically seen, for the Ottomans, Abdu'l Baha's presence in the American capital was a sensitive political issue that could disturb actually the balance with Iran and Russia. The government in Istanbul did not initially want the ambassador to be in contact with Abdu'l Baha. In this memorandum, which you see from the Ottoman archives, which Yusuf Ziya Pasha sent to Istanbul, he states that considering Abdu'l Baha's positive reception by eminent people in America, his constant praises of the Young Turkish Committee that displayed justice and liberated him, and the gathering given in his honor by the Iranian embassy at which he had been present, the Ottoman embassy could not be indifferent toward him. Therefore, Abdu'l Baha and some of his followers were honored with a dinner at the Ottoman embassy. Yusuf Ziya Pasha adds that this was received positively, and his followers wrote a letter of gratitude to be forwarded to the Young Turk government in Istanbul, hoping that the Baha'is may be of assistance to the Young Turk Committee. Now, this is the letter which the American Baha'is sent in the name of Abdu'l Baha through Yusuf Ziya Pasha, which was sent to Istanbul and which is now in the Ottoman archives. It's handwritten and accompanied by signatures and organized as a small booklet, and it contains about 800 signatures from American Baha'is from different communities. And this is the letter of gratitude, which says, To the Committee of Union and Progress, with the utmost thankfulness do we, the undersigned, submit this letter to the Committee of Union and Progress in order to express our heartfelt appreciation of the good work accomplished by that enlightened committee. The former despotic government of Turkey incarcerated Abbas Effendi in prison, but when the respected Committee of Union and Progress hoisted the banner of liberty and freedom, they established justice and gave succor and help to all the oppressed. Through their efforts, Abbas Effendi was liberated and is now traveling in the United States of America. And his activities are directed towards international peace and the conciliation and unification of all mankind. We, the friends of Abbas Effendi, are in the greatest joy that he is free and able to travel in our land. And with profound gratitude do we offer our thanks to the respected Committee of Union and Progress for their service to humanity. It is our hope that we may be of assistance to the Committee of Union and Progress. And here you see some of the signatures of the Baha'is, of the American Baha'is. On the left, you have the signature of Thornton Chase, the first American Baha'i. In the middle, you have Stanwood Cobb, also one of the early American Baha'is, and who also was actually 3 years in Istanbul in the 1910s, working as a teacher. You have the signature of Howard McNutt and many, many others, as I said, around 800 signatures. And again, we have a description of how Abdu'l Baha's influence actually convinced the Ottomans and Iran, who were the enemies of the Baha'i faith, that they would change actually their opinion, as we have seen in the example of Yusuf Ziya Pasha and other Ottoman officials. We have a description of the daughter of Ali Quli Khan, Marzia Gale, who writes in her book about her father, about her family. She says, whereas Iran and the Ottoman Empire persecuted the Baha'is in the early days, now they had paid homage to Abdu'l Baha. Both the Persian legation and the Turkish embassy, legally even in America, the countries themselves, opened their doors to the one-time prisoner. We remember too how much malevolence had been directed toward Baha'u'llah from the Persian embassy at Constantinople, which ultimately for a time was to be headed by Ali Quli Khan, a Baha'i. Again, the last member of the Qajar dynasty, Ahmad Shah, that dynasty which had sent thousands of Baha'is to their death, would be hosted by Khan and at the same embassy in Constantinople, and would come to rely heavily on this follower of Baha'u'llah. So up to here, we have, up to 1913, we have positive encounters between young Turks and Abdu'l Baha. Unfortunately, after 1913, as I mentioned, when the three Pashas took over the Young Turk regime, they were militant nationalist Young Turks who seized power with the coup d'etat Enver Cemal and Talat Pasha, and placed themselves as the ruling, in fact, dictatorial triumvirate. And so after that, the euphoria over liberty, equality, and brotherhood of the Young Turks did not last long. Unfortunately, many problems appeared in the horizon, and the Ottomans were also dragged into First World War I, and especially this Young Turk rule after 1913 proved to be more repressive and bloodier of that of Sultan Abdul Hamid. The attitude, especially of this man here, Cemal Pasha, who was military governor of the Ottomans in Syria during the World War, towards Abdu'l Baha, was in contrast to the opinion of early and liberal Young Turk leaders. Cemal Pasha was a sworn enemy of Abdu'l Baha due to false accusations made by his half-brother Muhammad Ali, And believing the statements of Muhammad Ali and his allies among Ottoman officials, Jamal Pasha actually promised that on his return from the conquest of the Suez Canal, he would kill Abdu'l Baha by crucifying him or kill him by hanging or death by a firing squad, according to the wish of Abbas Effendi. Abdu'l Baha stated that Jamal Pasha was a cruel, boisterous, impetuous, and barbarous man beyond any description. They constantly provoke him against us, never leaving him alone, ceaselessly sowing seeds of doubt. Later, when actually Abdu'l Baha, when Jamal Pasha met Abdu'l Baha in Ottoman Palestine, Jamal Pasha's anger subsided and he enjoyed Abdu'l Baha's presence. We have this description again by this physician of Abdu'l Baha, Dr. Habib Muayyad. So after Jamal Pasha arrived at Akka, he called on Abdu'l Baha to his presence, and then Abdu'l Baha goes to the military tent of Jamal Pasha, and Jamal Pasha greets him. He came close and invited the master to come sit near him. Then he immediately roared, "You are a religious mischief maker, and for this reason the government has exiled you." Later, Abdu'l Baha would relate, "I realized that he was drunk and prideful to such a point that if a chain or a piece of metal was handed to him, he would tear it apart. Therefore, I thought that since he was a Turk, it was best for me to reply in such a way that would make him laugh and would also of necessity quiet him. I replied to him, there are two kinds of troublemakers, political and religious." Then before the audience, I pointed to him and continued, Praise be God that so far no harm has come from the political mischief makers," which means that during this reign of Abdul Hamid, Jamal Pasha was known as a political troublemaker. And then Abdu'l Baha says, "Inshallah, no harm will come from this religious mischief maker," meaning himself. With that, Jamal Pasha burst into loud laughter and joyfully said, "By God, you are right." Then Jamal Pasha asked Abdu'l Baha, "What is the cause of the Ottoman Empire's weakness?" Abdu'l Baha responded, "The existence of conflicting religions." He asked, "What is the remedy?" The master replied that the leaders of all religions and denominations existing within the Ottoman Empire and Islamic lands gather in Istanbul and after consultations agree on a single and unifying religion. Once more, Jamal Pasha said, "By God, you are right." The Pasha's anger and enmity subsided, and he expressed a desire for a second meeting. He said, "I'm now proceeding to Egypt to conquer that region and to drive the enemy into the sea and the Suez Canal. After my return, I will take you to Constantinople. There I will gather the religious leaders and force them into unity and agreement in one religion. Here your station is not evident." Unfortunately, this didn't realize. After this positive encounter, Jamal Pasha's attitude towards Abdu'l Baha once again changed for the worse due to further negative reports about him, reports to him about Abdu'l Baha by his half-brother, and Jamal Pasha promised to crucify Abdu'l Baha when he returned victorious from the military campaigns in the Sinai. But as we know, his troops were defeated by the British army, and so Abdu'l Baha was also actually liberated from this terrible situation. And at the beginning of World War I, as we know, Abdu'l Baha planned actually to take practical steps and to intervene peacefully against belligerents. He intended to convene a gathering, as we are told by Mr. Balyuzi, of leading Muslim and Christian leaders in Palestine, where he hoped to advise them to cooperate to avoid disorder and chaos in the region. Abdu'l Baha was prevented by opponents from doing so. And despite that Abdu'l Baha was actually occupied with local affairs and took over the task of providing food for the people in the region. Despite all this, he did all this and provided he provided food for the people during First World War I who suffered from the mismanagement of the Ottoman overlord. So thank you. I will stop here. Are there any questions? Do you hear me?
We hear you.
Great. Okay. Thank you for your patience.
It was, I honestly, I don't think I'm knowledgeable enough to ask questions, but I'm just blown away. I was born in the island of Malta, and so Turkey and Malta have quite a history. And this is fascinating, and I wonder if you have made a book of this.
Yes, actually, I have. It was in the last talk that John mentioned my first book, which is a revised version of my PhD thesis.
Yeah, wonderful.
I can somehow share the title with you.
Yeah, that would be great.
And I have an academic website where also there are other articles which I wrote after my book, which you also can access easily. And the link actually is on the Clearwater Baha'i's website under my short bio. Is that right, John? I think there's a link to Nejati on academia.edu.
Yes, that's
Yes.
Currently the case. Yes.
Yes.
If people go to your bio on the last line, following the last paragraph, it says see Nejati on academia.edu. It's a hyperlink.
Yes.
So with that said, we have a question from Terry McBride. Please, welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate this presentation. It's very thorough, and I'm just kind of curious how this kind of relates to the current geopolitical situation that we have right now with, well, Israel right now is at war with various forces, and my particular interest is, recent history from about 1950, Iran, how the United States was involved and all this kind of stuff. And I'm just kind of curious what your take on that would be.
No, you're touching on a very, very delicate issue.
Well, if you can't,
I think it's a good idea. It's just a good idea. We focus on the subject of what we've spoken about. So for questions, if anyone has questions off topic, as great as it is, we should talk to Dr. Al-Khan separately outside this presentation.
Yes, and also maybe you have questions about the last presentation.
That as well. We're sorry to inform everyone that we didn't have room for questions in the last presentation. Of course, carry over from the last presentation questions. We would love to have those asked here. There are two hands raised. However, prior to that, someone had sent a question prior to these questions being asked in the chat, and the question was: Has Abdu'l Baha explained what divine politics is? What is divine politics according to Abdu'l Baha? Do we have any resource that explains this?
I mean, I think, when also Shulg Effendi talks about divine policy in some of his letters and writings. So it's basically all this framework which Baha'u'llah gave us, the principles, and I mean, it's about reorganizing the world, reforming the world. So basically, it's this impetus which Baha'u'llah gave, and then Abdu'l Baha continued and elaborated, and also the divine, like the structure of the Baha'i administration. I would say it all includes this divine politics, which is, as you know, from the Baha'i view, is supposed to to save the world from all evils, if we work enough for that, of course.
And also, Abdu'l Baha wrote two works that are, I believe both of them were anonymous: The Secret of Divine Civilization, and yet untranslated work called Risaleh Siyasiyeh.
Exactly.
I don't know how it's pronounced in English. If you could translate that, would be great.
It's treatise on politics, basically. Yes. And so the Secret of Divine Civilization we have, it's actually, Shogefen says it's the blueprint for the reconstruction of the world, something like this. I can find the quote. And as you said, the unpublished treatise on politics is Risale Siyasiye, which is also outstanding contribution, especially also about the situation in Iran in the 1890s. Abdu'l Baha addresses some issues, and also he also, like in this Turkish letter which I read and quoted, he also says that like clerics shouldn't be involved in politics, basically, especially in Iran. And he also shows, he shows, for example, the deposition of Sultan Abdul Aziz. He mentions that, and he says that the clerics were involved, and they wanted war. They were calling for war in the Ottoman Empire, and so Abdu'l Baha cautions actually the Iranians, especially the politicians, not to let the clerics involved in political matters. And so it's all about, but on the basis we have this spiritual, framework that Baha'u'llah gave us. And it's interesting that Abdu'l Baha, especially in Secret of Divine Civilization, there's not a single word says Baha'i or Baha'u'llah, doesn't mention him nor Baha'u'llah. It's just, as you said, written anonymously, but it infused with Baha'i ideas.
Thank you so much for sharing this. And again, for everyone who's listened, the subject of this divine civilization, you can go to a reference library, the Baha'i reference library, or if you go to oceanlibrary.com, you can find the Secret of Divine Civilization for free for your reading purposes and learning and research. Now we have two hands raised. I'm sorry, I forgot who raised first. So without offending anyone, I just would like to go alphabetical. We have Bijan, then Joseph.
Thank you. Nejati, you have heard me often say that you're truly groundbreaking.
Thank you.
But I wanted others to hear it too here, that I often compare what he's doing with the Ottoman archives to what Mujan Momen did in the 1980s with his groundbreaking publication of the Baha'u'llah Regions 1844 to 1944, and also what Yulia Ionesyan is doing with the Russian archives. I think future generations will truly appreciate what you're doing today, and it'll take years before Baha'is and non-Baha'is would discover the value of the gems that you're sharing with us today. I don't have a question, but I had just one comment from last presentations when we were talking about reasons why Baha'u'llah and his companions were exiled from Adrianople to the fortress of Akka. I think one of the main reasons that also Amanat and Vahman mentioned in their book, From Tehran to Akka, which is in Persian, but it's in the process of being translated into English, is that one of the machinations of Azalis was these bulletins that they would write in the name of Baha'u'llah and Baha'is, and would drop them at nights in the houses of the inhabitants of Adrianople. And therefore, when those were shared with the government officials, they believed those sheer lies. And Baha'u'llah eventually finds out about it and finds the names of about 10 people who were engaged in that plot. And he even shares those names with the government officials. Unfortunately, they didn't listen, and eventually basically exiled both brothers, one to the fortress of Akka and the other one to Famagusta, Cyprus. That's all.
Thank you. Thank you, Bijan.
Joseph, welcome, please.
when my wife and I were visiting in England, we went to Westminster Abbey. We saw the grave of and statue of the Cannings. My understanding was Sir Richard Canning was an ambassador from the United Kingdom to the Ottoman Empire, which covered a period of time that included 1844 during the Tanzimat period. I inquired from one of the proctors that was there, stating that in a book called Thief in the Night, that there was a proclamation that was made, and they informed me that they have all of the archives of Sir Richard Canning in the Westminster Abbey archives in the upstairs library. Said, would you like to go? And I said, yes.
Wow.
That the librarians that were there were able to find that proclamation in 1844, 1st of Nisan. And it said that the people of the book had the freedom to be within the land without owning it. Is basically what they were able to find. People of the book, meaning both Christians and Jews. Do you have from the archives in of the Ottoman Empire that same proclamation? I would like to know if the original is there.
That's an issue which Baha'is have been haunting since they read Thief in the Night, I think. The claim is that that this edict of tolerance, I think you mean that, was issued by the Ottomans on 21st of March 1844, so coinciding more or less with the revelation of the Bab. Edict of toleration, and then Baha'is claim that from that point on, the Jews would be allowed to go back to the Holy Land, to Israel, and settle and so on. So, but I haven't seen any single document like this saying, there is no such edict of toleration, but the document you mentioned is rather talking about, during the Tanzimat, during the reforms, the non-Muslims were granted more freedom, and especially in 1844, what also happened was, it was about the religious freedom and practicing their religion freely in the Ottoman Empire, which they already did actually for centuries, but this was now guaranteed once more time. And it was also about abolishing the punishment of apostasy, actually, for Muslims.
Yes.
For Muslims becoming Christians, for example, that was then legally forbidden. And so it's I don't think it's a single document, but rather a few documents that would grant more rights to Muslims, to Christians, to Jews, and so on.
Well, in the English, which they gave me copies of, there was one that was on that date, specifically, and it was something that Canning, who was he was more specifically concerned about the Christians,
yes,
and their safety within the Holy Land. But it said the people of the book, not just, it didn't just specifically say Christians, it said people of the book.
Right.
Now, that may be just the way that they referred to Christians, but that's not my understanding.
Would you share that?
So anyway, if you have any opportunity to do another dive,
sure,
I would certainly appreciate that, because I would like to know if what I have in English has any counterpart within the archives. I don't read or write Arabic or Turkish, It would be
Okay.
futile. It would be futile for me to even attempt.
I will try. I will do my best. I'm always diving into the archives, so hopefully.
So,
Okay,
Nejati, we
Yes.
have room for one more question.
Yes,
We
sure.
have room for one more question, and then we like to ask everyone who has questions to please hold on to them after this last question for next week. And if after this question, we just want to give a little foretaste of what next week will be, and then we'll close out. So there's one last question, and this is from Gilbert in the audience. And the question, it pertains to a historical issue that has been mentioned in some other presentations outside of what Dr. Al-Khan has spoken about, but it's something as a matter of clarification we'd like to understand a little better. So we understand that there are two major sects of Islam, being the Shia sect and the Sunni sect. And of course, the others that exist around the world, there are some other beliefs and whatnot, but the two major ones we're just discussing for now, Sunni and Shia. Sunnis have historically viewed Shia as heretics, and likewise the other way. Now, the question is, how did the Turkish people view the Iranian Shias and their view on the Baha'i religion? The question also has to do with, for example, it was about the attacks by Iranian Shias towards Baha'is. How was this mirrored in the Ottoman Empire in a very brief way? Because I know there's a lot of variance throughout the history, but maybe we could talk about this in another presentation, perhaps.
So briefly, what was the attitude of Sunni Turks towards the Baha'is? Is that the question? Did I get it right?
Briefly, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
you cut
Yes.
out right after you said briefly. One more time, the question.
Yeah. Should I explain now briefly?
Could you repeat that?
Should I now answer your question? Is that
Yes,
sure.
briefly.
So basically, I mean, it's the thing is that you know, in Iran up to this day, Baha'is are persecuted, and in Turkey or the Ottoman Empire, we know that Baha'u'llah was exiled a few times, and you know, he says it was a grief injustice. But if you look at Ottoman Sunni Islam, the Ottoman version of Sunni Islam, you will see that is you can also see it through the centuries that I'm not saying it was perfect, but I would say they were dealing with it quite in a peaceful way with other non-Muslim communities. The thing is that the Ottomans, or in general Islamic rulers, they didn't try to convert anyone to Islam because they would get more taxes from non-Muslims than from Muslims. You see what I mean? So, and then there was this overall tolerance, and then especially the Ottomans, they granted freedom for the different Christian denominations and the Jews, and for a very few exceptions, they didn't convert them to Islam because it was not practical, it was not economical, and so on. And in general, when you look at Islam in the Ottoman Empire, it actually grew out of a more Sufi environment. Even though it was Sunni, the Turks were much influenced by Sufi, by liberal ideas, by being like benevolent to other followers of religions. And I think for that reason, because it was then established over the centuries, also the Ottomans, even though they regarded Baha'u'llah as a heretic and so on, they, even though they exiled him, they didn't, as far as I know, they didn't kill any single Babi or Baha'i in the Ottoman Empire. And in contrast to this, they even, as I mentioned last Sunday, they even gave money to Baha'u'llah for his travel expenses, or that he could live in Istanbul or Edirne. So we have, I think we have a really stark contrast between Iran and the Ottoman attitude towards the Baha'is.
That is very enlightening to reflect on this in closing for the presentation today, that there was a very stark contrast in treatment between the two governments of the Baha'is versus the understanding that one may have that Baha'is are viewed as heretics, therefore condemned to death outright. Where in the Ottoman Empire, this didn't happen, where they were killed for their beliefs, like it was the case in Persia at the time, right?
Right. Yes.
That's very enlightening. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And you wrote that I should mention my next talk, which is in 2 weeks, actually, not next week. Right?
Yes, we would love to. We would love to hear what is the subject of the next talk that's coming up.
This would be on 22nd of October. Yes.
Yes, sir.
Last Sunday, I mentioned one disciple of the Bab, one letter of the living, Mullah Ali Bastami, who was...
You kind of cut out. Mullah Ali Bastami, right?
Bastami, yes. Yes, it's one of the letters of the living, and I mentioned that there are a few documents about him in the Ottoman archives, and we have Baha'i sources and writings of the Bab and Baha'u'llah about him. So I would like to follow with you his life from Iran to his trials in Baghdad and then in Istanbul, and a little bit concentrate on this exceptional first Babi, actually, who suffered for the cause.
Thank you so much for sharing this with us. Now, all of you who have joined us, and those who have brought questions, and those who are holding on to questions for the next presentation on the 22nd, we thank you. How can people contact you, Dr. Alkan, with questions prior to the next presentation?
I can write my email address, and then you have it.
So for those of you who have those questions you raised, please take a look at the email here in the Zoom meeting chat. We thank you for doing so, Dr. Alkan. So it's Nikati. I'm going to say it phonetically with a C. Nikati at Alkan with a K.de.
Yes.
Thank you so much. NECATI at ALKAN.de. With that being said, if you enjoyed this presentation and you haven't checked out the YouTube or the Facebook page, we welcome you to go to Clearwater Baha'is on YouTube, subscribe, like the video, and we're going to be making a playlist so you can have this all in the same playlist. The Facebook page for the Baha'i Center of Clearwater, this is, again, the Clearwater Baha'is hosting this, though the Clearwater Baha'is on YouTube has one name. We have the Baha'i Center of Clearwater as the second name for the Facebook page. So please check that out. We have events locally. If you visit, you're welcome to, of course, join on Zoom, but we love your presence in person. That being so, we thank again Dr. Nejati Alkan for presenting on these very important subjects. And again, we welcome you to join again as Dr. Alkan begins the next presentation on October 22nd. We hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you again, Dr. Alkan.
Thank you for having me. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.